Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, Theories of Experiential Jewish Education and Jewish Teen Philanthropy. We invite those of you who are on Twitter to follow along and join in the conversation on Twitter today by tweeting to @JTFN or using the hashtag Teen Philanthropy. During this webinar, we will hear from two presenters, Phil Liff-Grieff, Associate Director of Builders of Jewish Education in Los Angeles, followed by Lindsay Ganci, Director of Youth Engagement at the Community Synagogue of Port Washington, New York. Phil will provide an introduction to experiential education theory, covering concepts of continuity, scaffolding, reflection, and teachable moments. Lindsay will then join us to share how she is applying these theories of experiential education to the Community Synagogue Teen Foundation board. I'll be sharing their complete bios with you in the chat so you can read them. And now with that, I want to turn the call over to Phil.
Great, thank you. Am I unmuted?
You are, we hear you.
Good, just wanted to be sure. Otherwise I'd be talking to myself. I'm delighted to be here this morning, afternoon, and also delighted to be co-presenting with Lindsay. Listening to the people who introduce themselves on this call, it makes me really want to be able to sit in a room with all of you. I think we have a lot to talk about that's hard sometimes to do in this format. So I guess we'll settle for this, and hopefully there'll be other opportunities. So the topic is thinking about theory and how it can help us improve our practice in providing high-quality educational experiences. Before I jump into those theories, I want to define what we're talking about. There's a lot of talk these days about experiential education, a lot of very lengthy explanations of what that means. I'm going to suggest two very basic ways of thinking about our topic today. I would look at this as either education that has experience at its core, or experiences that are meant to provide a specific educational outcome. And that's really, the latter is really important because we have to be mindful of the fact that good education only happens when you know what you're educating towards. So knowing one's specific desired outcomes, educational goals, that's really critical to everything that we're going to be looking at today, and hopefully to everything that we all do in our work. So we'll come back to that again and again, but that is really the basis of experiential education, is knowing what you're trying to accomplish, very simply. So with that in mind, we're going to jump back to our first, let me get caught up, there it is. Our first theorist, John Dewey, is an American philosopher who, as you can see, lived quite some time ago. And that proves very interesting because when you read Dewey, you'll see that his thinking is very much aligned with the thinking that we're doing today. I've taken two quotes out of a very short book. It was really a lecture that he delivered in 1938 called Experience in Education. I would strongly advise you purchasing it. But we're going to look at two quotes. He talked about the role of experience in education and how to make experience more educational. To me, the most important thing that comes from Dewey, the father of experiential education, is this first quote. Not all experience is educational. That's a really important thing to start with. If we start from a place that experiences can result in good things, educational outcomes, they can also result in what Dewey called miseducative responses, which are exactly the opposite. That means we have to do something to make experiences educational. And I'm going to be using throughout my favorite example, an experience of teens at a homeless shelter serving a meal. We have educational outcomes. We want to accomplish something with this experience. It could be a feeling of empathy, a desire to help, a sense of connectedness, whatever it may be. Some of the kids in such an experience, without doing anything more than the experience itself, may come out accomplishing those goals. Others could come out saying, these people are disgusting, I have nothing to do with them, I feel further from them than I did before we did this experience. That to Dewey is a miseducative outcome. So the question he asks, and the question we should ask, is how do we ensure that experience is educative? It actually accomplishes what we want. And Dewey had two principles that he focused on. We're going to look at one. One is continuity, and the other is interaction. What does that mean? Interaction is simple. That is the interaction between the internal workings of the person and the environment that they're encountering. Continuity I want us to look at, and I have a quote here from his book. To Dewey, continuity means that every experience both takes up something from those which have gone before and modifies those that come after. In other words, an experience not in a context is not necessarily educative. What's the context? Where are the kids coming from? What have they learned before? What language have they developed to understand their experience? How have they been prepared for that experience? And then, where is it going? Does it have a direction? Is it moving to something else? That, to Dewey, was critical for an experience to be educative. So, to me, these are the two big takeaways from John Dewey that we're going to look at, and I know Lindsay's going to talk about them in thinking about how we make educational experiences better. A second theorist, Liff-Vygotsky, a contemporary of Dewey's, a Russian psychologist, developed a theory that we call social constructivism. That has two words in it. Constructivism means the learner constructs their own knowledge, and social means it happens in a social context. So here were four takeaways, if you will, from the writings of Liff-Vygotsky that relate to our work. We're going to look at one of them in depth, but I want to go over them quickly. Learning is social and collaborative. It happens with other people. School, and we can learn from school, school should happen in the context of the world. There should be no separation. Learning should make sense in the context of what's going on out there. So we should ask ourselves the question, is the experience that the kids are having related to the greater world that they live in, their lives, the community that they exist in? Out-of-school experiences should relate back in the same way, and then this is the contribution that we're going to be thinking about. He described a zone of proximal development, a way that a learner learns by moving towards growth in a very specific way. Let's look at that. Here's essentially what the zone of proximal development means. The ellipse, the blue ellipse in the middle, is what the learner is capable of. It's what they're comfortable with, what they know, what skills they're able to exhibit, their place where they are at the moment. If learning only relates, or if experiences only relates to what the learner can do, the place they are at the moment, there's no growth. So the zone that you see here is what the learner can do with help. Scaffolding essentially means support or resources. How do we help the learner move outside of what they're comfortable with into areas that are new to them with help from educators, from the environment, from the community, from others? But you'll notice there's another ellipse outside of that zone, and that's what the learner is not yet able to do with or without scaffolding. I would look at the two ellipses to the right as the area of challenge. Do we challenge our learners to grow? Do we challenge them with new ideas? But do we do it in a way that they're still able to move forward? Or do we move them too far where instead of seeing growth, we see frustration, we see discomfort, we see anxiety? So thinking about this as a zone, a place that's outside of what they already know, but is not so far removed that they're going to be uncomfortable and as a result not able to learn. How do we know where we are? Looking at their reactions. Where do they feel comfortable? Where do they not? And what happens when they move into that zone and they learn something new? Their blue ellipse expands. They can now do something new, think something new, express something new, and the zone pushes out further. We call that growth. I'm going to move up a little bit into our time now. And the question arises, fine, how does that process happen? How does the learner actually process experience in such a way that it involves growth? And what you're seeing on this slide, besides a picture of David Kolb, who is the professor of organizational behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. I would hate to see his business card. He's a thinker who developed a model for how experiential learning actually takes place within the individual. And we're looking at a very simplified version of that model here. It starts often with a concrete experience. Something happens, right? Something takes place. And the learner interacts with something. This is Dewey's interaction. There is an awareness of something taking place. Something happens inside the learner. And you look at the next phase in this process. The learner reflects on, thinks about what's happened, is aware of what happened, and processes it in some way. The result of that is that they then generalize from that experience to an idea, a concept, something that they can apply elsewhere. And that results in doing something new. The doing of something new results in a new experience, and that's why this looks like a cycle. You should think of this, though, not as a circle, but as a three-dimensional spiral, because hopefully the result is growth. So that every experience I have, if I reflect, I develop new insights. With those new insights, I'm able to generalize to new experiences, and so on. The result is learning and growth. This is very simplified. The more recent work has created a much more complex and nuanced view of this, but this is useful to us, I think. The key to all of these models is reflection. That having the experience, as Dewey said, is only an experience unless there's a reflective process. How do we as educators know if there's a reflective process? We don't. So what we have to do is ensure that we've included reflection in our work to make sure that process takes place. How do I help the kid at the homeless shelter feel other than this sense of disgust? Through doing some reflective work together so that we can process it together and move towards an educative result. I have a simplified way of looking at this. Basically, do something. What happened here? What are the implications of that? So what? And now what? This is a really good way of working with experience. What happened? What does that mean? And what's going to be different as a result of that insight? I'm going to throw one other theory in here, and then we're going to talk about the implications of all of these together. I had a teacher many years ago who was one of the founding thinkers of what's called confluent education, which is education that takes equal count of both cognitive thinking processes and affective emotional processes. His name is Aaron Hillman, and he used to say something very simple but to me very profound. He said, "Nothing never happens." While we plan and while we work for specific educational outcomes, and while we stay focused on ensuring that everything moves towards those goals that are evident in those outcomes, we also want to be sensitive to those teachable moments, those moments that may be outside of what we planned, but that provide opportunity for growth. Nothing never happens. In other words, something always happens. Did the program fail? What happened here? What happened? So what? Now what? How can we learn and how can we grow from every experience? How can we turn miseducative experience, using Dewey's language, to educative experience by looking at where the growth can happen? So those are really the four very basic theories that I'm presenting. You'll have opportunities to ask questions about them. But I want to give you a checklist, a brief listing of the things we should think about based on these theoretical approaches as we do programming, as we do experiential education. And again, thinking about that specific program of being in a homeless shelter or in a soup kitchen and having kids interact with the people who are there, make sure that these things are happening. Dewey's concept of continuity. Is there a context? Is this experience one that the kids have been prepared for, that they have the language for, that they are ready for? But at the same time, with number two, is it an experience that moves them outside of where they're comfortable? In other words, is there some aspect of challenge in this experience? But is it so uncomfortable for them? Is it so outside of what they're prepared for that they're so anxious that they can't learn? That's that zone, knowing where they are and asking, is it enough? Is it too much? Are we scaffolding the learner? Think about scaffolding like this. What is scaffolding? Scaffolding is a metal framework that's put up outside of a building as it's being built. It supports the building while it's being built. It supports the people who are building it, but it's temporary. When the building is built, when the construction is done, the scaffolding is taken down and the building stands on its own. That's what we do when we scaffold. We provide support to allow the learner to build what they're building, new knowledge, new awareness, new attitudes, new insights. We provide them resources with our guidance and suggestions, with outside resources and materials, whatever it may be that's appropriate to that process. But we understand that the purpose of that support is to allow them to grow on their own without that support. It's temporary. Does the learner have an opportunity to reflect? Reflection should happen after an experience has happened. But reflection can also happen before an experience has happened as part of the preparation. It can happen much later. Our goal is to help our learners be reflective about what they do so that they develop these insights, develop this change in how they see the world that comes not only from experiencing things, but also being sure that you process them appropriately, again, with the right scaffolding. So not only do they reflect, but is reflection being used as a tool to work towards your goals? And then, finally, are we taking advantage of teachable moments? Are we staying in touch with what's happening and not so focused on our goals that we lose sight of something that may happen that allows us to help the learner grow? So even in the soup kitchen where the participant has feelings of disgust and discomfort, that on one hand could be seen as a failure. On the other hand, it could be a teachable moment. How do we turn that expression by that student into a moment for thinking about human dignity, for maybe studying text about human dignity and how we respond to the other and see some of ourselves in the other? So those are really my comments. I'm happy to entertain questions, and to prove how happy I am, I have this lovely slide with question marks on it. With that, how are we going to do this, Naomi?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. So I encourage anyone who has questions to type them into the chat box. I'm going to start off by asking the following. How does scaffolding relate to the zone of proximal development? Could you talk about that?
So the zone of proximal development is that place in which a learner can grow with help. And so scaffolding is that help. So what does that mean? That could be an educator providing materials that the learner uses that makes them comfortable. It could be environmental. It could be a setting where there is a culture of trust and comfort, where a learner is prepared to reach outside of where they are socially. So scaffolding is that help that allows the learner to move into that zone, because by definition it's not a place that they're comfortable being, and feel comfortable there because they're getting some help from a teacher, an educator, facilitator, counselor, or peers.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil. So I just want to encourage other people to type any questions you have into the chat box. We're just keeping lines muted because we have a lot of people on today and we don't want to have too much background noise.
I see a question here from Michal. What was the fourth theory, confluence? It's not a big fancy theory with names. It's really just 3 words. Realizing that something is always happening. That's the nothing never happens. The person who said that was one of the main thinkers in the development of confluent education, but I'm not ready to attach that label to it. It's certainly central to the work of confluent education, of creating an environment in which both one's emotions and one's intellect are engaged in the process of growing and learning.
Great. I see another question there. Phil, perhaps you understand better what it is referring to. There may be some jargon I'm missing. Is UBD?
Oh, there's no jargon there.
Okay, is that a mistake?
That's understanding by design, and I think it's a very legitimate way. There are many different ways.
Wait, so let me
right.
voice the question to everyone, because only
sorry. That's right. Not everyone sees it.
So is learning by design a legitimate way of developing outcome identification? So
if we need to start with where we want to get to, there are a number of different approaches to doing that. Understanding by design is one of them. Essentially, our goal is to work backwards. Whatever method we use, this is a wonderful one. This is an excellent way to do that, of saying simply, what do I want to accomplish? What are the understandings that I want, for example, to have universal among my learners? And then what do I do to get there? I have found in a lot of programming there's a tendency to jump into the program and work very hard in being sure that everything runs smoothly without having this final outcome in front of one. And so it's really important to use UBD or some other approach to being able to say, I know very clearly, all of us are clear on what we want to accomplish. We also have an opportunity along the way to see whether or not we're moving in that direction. So yes, I think it's an excellent way of accomplishing that.
Terrific. Another question. So in the soup kitchen example that you've been speaking about, where do you see reflection happening? At the event in the same space? I think they probably refer to like at the soup kitchen or at a later event. And this person said this often creates a challenge for her during site visit programs.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So can you talk more about this facilitating post-event reflection?
So I would start with doing reflection before the event. You're taking students into an environment, at least I know for the students that I'm familiar with in Los Angeles, they're not exactly comfortable in an environment like a homeless shelter or a soup kitchen. So I would do some work with them that is reflective in nature beforehand to give them a chance to talk out what they're feeling, what they anticipate, what they expect, which then gives you something to work with during the program. It would be ideal to find a space, but I know it's sometimes very difficult. So if there's no opportunity during the program to sit for 15 minutes afterwards, then I would do it as soon afterwards as possible, because it's important that both the cognitive learnings that took place there, but also the emotional reactions be fresh in their mind. And if you've done some reflection beforehand, you have already a baseline to think about in terms of what did you think or expect before the program, what happened, how do I feel now. I would always interject some text about, here again, human dignity, to think about how did what I felt and what I did relate to what I had expected. And then it would be useful to do some reflective activity much later where they talk about or write about or paint about or sing about or whatever they do, to really get a sense of how they've internalized what they learned there.
Yeah, I will back up that point, saying that often when, especially with our CAMP program, when we train program leaders for teen philanthropy programs, and part of that program is to go on a site visit. We encourage people to see if there is a space they can use to ask the organization that question in advance so that they can have some time for reflection about the experience before they get back on the bus and back into their camp day. All right, so I think I'll take one other question, and remember, if you have any others, please do put them in the chat. This one was emailed to me. Can you talk about how this relates to informal education? Is there a difference between the concept of experiential and informal education?
I love this question. Thank you. And I see that my colleague David Breifman is on the phone. I wish I could have him jump in, but nevertheless.
Did I unmute David?
No, it's okay. We used to call all of this kind of work informal education. And it became clear that this dichotomy of formal, informal was really not accurate, that in point of fact, there are things that happen in formal settings that are of this type. There are things that happen in informal settings that are very formal. I'm reminded of the Hebrew classes that took place under a tree at camp. Just because it's under a tree doesn't make it necessarily experiential education. So the language that we tend to use now is the learning that takes place is experiential, meaning that experience is at the core of learning. And the settings that we normally think of, like camp and youth group and museums and Israel trips, meeting-based travel, all of that are informal settings. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's sort of the same thing. It is the same thing, but we use different language now that we feel is more accurate in capturing the nature of what this thing is. Great.
I think that's a great question to sum up with. We're going to turn the call over to Lindsay to talk about how all of this applies to the Teen Foundation. And Phil will stay on the line, so if any questions come up, we'll have another opportunity at the end. So feel free to keep using that chat. And now Lindsay.
Hi everyone. My name is Lindsay Ganci, and I'm the Director of Youth Engagement at the Community Synagogue in Port Washington. We are currently in our second year of a pilot program with the Jewish Teen Funders Network for Long Island institutions who've started teen foundations, and today I'm going to be explaining a little bit about how we are using Phil's experiential education checklist in action in our work with the teens involved in our program. So the first item on that list is context. I think it's important that we consider the context we're offering for all of the programming we're doing with teens in an experiential educational setting. My example is that I have a very specific and structured attendance requirement that I really hold our kids and participants accountable for in our program. This makes it possible to make sure that our lessons aren't standalone, where if you walk into the room and you've missed 3 sessions, you feel completely caught up. I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing. The goal here is that kids come in and they're using vocabulary that we've used in previous lessons. They have their experience from their previous lessons fresh in their mind, so that when we sit down to do our work together, things have a flow and move inside of a context, as opposed to feeling that an isolated lesson is going to give you a full experience, which I don't believe that it can. I think this context is an opportunity to really make connections to the work that we're doing for our participants so that they feel engaged. It doesn't often feel engaging to walk into a room and feel that everything you're experiencing in that one moment, in that 1 hour or 2, is complete. And I think it's important that it builds on what came before and move towards what comes next. And so that's where context comes into play. The next item on the experiential education checklist is continuity. Dewey's principle of continuity, which Phil has explained to us so well, is really important in the work that we're doing with teens in a youth setting, in an experiential education setting, and definitely with teen philanthropy. As I said before, it's important to continuously review vocabulary that we use with our foundation members. That creates a continuity to the work that we're doing and makes sure that we're not having lessons that are absent, where the vocabulary is absent. I think it's an important part of creating a continuity when we have a language that we can continue to use, and that builds on learning potential. Continuity in experiential education creates community. And a community means a place where people want to be, where they want to belong. That means that it's fun for them, where memories can be made. And I think that this sense of continuity often leads to an interest in continued participation, which is a goal we always have for participants in our work. The next item on the checklist for experiential education in our work is challenge. As Phil described, challenge isn't something that's supposed to hinder opportunities for learning, but it's supposed to push us towards somewhere where we're not so comfortable and have the opportunity to continue to learn. Site visits, obviously, when you're working with teens in a foundational setting, are going to propose challenges, and those often have great educative value. And as you see on the slide, I personally believe that the most educative experiences are the ones when we're proposing a challenge for our participants. They often yield the greatest rewards. I have this photo here of the roadmap to college. The example that I'd like to share about how challenge has played a role in the education my participants in our youth program and our Teen Foundation have experienced is that we went on a site visit to the local Boys and Girls Club on Long Island. It was a place that our kids felt very motivated by, and these young adults were put into a new setting where they maybe for the first time had to really open their eyes and see that getting to college and finding opportunities to get there is the reality for people who live maybe 20, 30, 40 minutes away from them. Our kids in our youth setting live in a bubble where everyone has different challenges to their life, but college is pretty much the expectation for all of our teens. And the challenge that existed in this experience was that they had to look outside of the mirror that they often look at and see what the rest of the world looks like. And this was an incredibly eye-opening experience for them to learn that their peers quite close to where they spend most of their time are really struggling to find ways to get to college. And these are experiences that really pose significant potential education for our participants. And I can't emphasize enough how important I think that challenge can be in making experiences educative. The next step on our experiential education checklist is scaffolding. This really is the role of an educator in any experiential educational models. We are to be controlling that learning environment and the context where learning takes place, where experiences happen, so that our learners can construct new meaning and new knowledge, not necessarily with our hand-holding, but with the building that we do to ensure that we are controlling experiences that happen in the environments that we create. This process of scaffolding ensures that teens are able to take ownership over their learning. They own it, and I think that creates a buy-in that frontal traditional educational models doesn't always offer, actually probably never offers learners in any setting. So this role of scaffolding in the work we're doing is quite important, and the more intentionality that I bring to the scaffolding I'm doing for our material often I find leads to the greatest beneficial outcomes for our participants. Teachable moments are so important. You have to know when to see them, and I think scaffolding plays a role in this. Scaffolding isn't something that happens spontaneously. It takes real focus and intentionality. So when you're facilitating a teen foundation or any other experiential educational opportunity, this is really the chance where you can form meaningful connections with your teens, specifically because as informal and experiential educators, we can call on those past experiences we've had with teens and young adults to really help create teachable moments. As Phil explained before, reflection is such an essential part of the learning process, especially in experiential education. In our Teen Foundation, we have a check ceremony at the end of our year so that congregants, family members, friends, community participants, everyone has a chance to learn and experience what our teens have been involved with all year long. And an essential part of that experience, that check ceremony, is when our teens share their written reflections of their year of learning with us. Not only is the process of writing them reflective for our teens, but I think sharing what they've learned through reflection is a really wonderful potential educative opportunity. And that is our entire experiential education checklist. I'd love to entertain any questions that you all have, and thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I think the first question that I have is, can you talk a little bit about how the grant review process fits into this framework of maybe challenge or scaffolding?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry, I was to speak on that. The grant review process in teen foundational work is a great example of where challenge fits into the work that we're doing and where we should be intentionally putting it into the work that we're doing with our teens. It's not an easy process, not only because the language of the grant proposals can often be dense and slightly challenging for our participants to learn from and really pull information out of, but consensus building in the work that we're doing often poses a huge challenge to adolescents who, in the current phase of their life that they're in, find it really hard to think on that bigger global scale and are often focused more on their own needs and wants. So consensus building is a real opportunity for challenge in the work that we're doing, and I think scaffolding that experience to make it that teens are and young adults have a hand in that process and teaching their peers, not just I give you something to read, you learn from it, and then you share that with your peers. Instead, giving the teens the opportunity to learn from the experience of reading them, presenting them to their peers, takes out of my hands as the educator and really gives them the opportunity to challenge themselves in a way that gives them more control, which I think is the goal at the end.
Thanks, Lindsay. So we got a couple of questions. I'm going to pull a couple of them. So the first question is, how do you create continuity between the programs? For example, how often I think there was kind of a side question of how often do your teams meet, and do you ask them to do anything between sessions to encourage connecting the material from different programs, from different sessions?
Okay, absolutely. So our Teen Foundation meets approximately once per month. Sometimes there's more like 3 weeks between meetings, and sometimes because of scheduling there's more like 5 or 6, and that's completely based on our synagogue's larger calendar. What I'll say is because I have multiple roles in our building, all of which involve my work with teens, there's continuity in their experience because of the relationship that I have with them. So when they're at an event that I'm running that's youth-centered and more experiential and outside of our teen foundation, I'm still going to bring up our past work or talk about what's coming up next. And I think that the relationship itself leads to a bit of continuity in my relationship with the teens, but also in the work that we're doing. And then very intentionally there are assignments that I give our participants to complete throughout the time that we're separate. It's never a written assignment with a due date, but I often encourage them to read an article that I've found or that JTFN has provided for us. In our current meeting just last night, we went through a process where we selected 2 areas of need our grant making will focus on, and I assigned 3 to 4 grant proposals that fall into those categories to each of our participants so that even if they've just read through them once or twice over the next couple of weeks, when we come back together as a group, they've had it fresh in their mind and they're not coming back to our class with without having revisited the work that we did in the previous week. And I think that forces a sense of continuity in our work.
Thank you, Lindsay. Another question, what are some other reflection techniques that can happen when facilitating a teen foundation? Perhaps there's other components of the process that can be used, for which reflection can be used as a tool.
Absolutely. Okay. 2 that I can think of off the top of my head, besides the reflections that are written and sort of a more formal reflective process. We never end our site visits. The goal would never be to end a site visit experience without at least a cup of coffee, a donut at Dunkin' Donuts, a pizza dinner back at our synagogue before I send the children home, so that we can sit as a group and really unpack our experience. I think that perhaps the most experiential educative experience we're offering our participants in our program is the site visit opportunity, which is always eye-opening and brings up a lot of thought and consideration for our participants. So I think in the moment, immediately after those experiences, it's important to unpack them, and that's something that we build into the site visit experience we plan for our board members. And I've had the kids free write when we have difficult, emotional, challenging conversation, because while I promote that and I think it's quite healthy, it can get heated. These are teens who feel passionate about our causes, and that's why they join us monthly. So it's important to honor that things can get heated, and that's a goal of our conversation. But I try to focus their thinking into writing so that we can have some personal time to think about how we're feeling before we launch into conversation, which can be a really great reflective tool.
Great. Phil, do you have anything to add on any of these last couple of questions or discussions?
I want to really support Lindsay's comments on this last issue of reflection. It's very easy to shortchange the reflection process. Not enough time, no place to do it. But the fact is that as educators, we have a responsibility to help our learners, to scaffold them as much as possible, and not just expect them to end up where we hope they'll end up without doing the work to help that happen. So the learning takes place as a result of the learner processing what they saw and thinking about how it made them feel or how it made them think, but then also it's really important that they share it, as Lindsay said, with others, because it's when we talk to ourselves it all makes sense, but when we share it with someone else, it's an opportunity to really explore what we're thinking or feeling or think we know in a way that, again, furthers our educational goals or the enduring understanding, if we want to use that language, that we're looking towards. So it's really important that we find the time, we find the place, and we create the culture within our group where reflection is a norm and an expectation as opposed to an add-on.
Thank you, Phil. I have another question from a Teen Foundation's program leader who is wondering if in his program, they may cram too much into meetings. They also meet once a month like Lindsay's program. So is there any research, perhaps this is for Phil, or theory about how much new content is too much to give teens in a single hour or a single experience, like a single event?
Well, far be it from me to lump all teens into one category in terms of how much they can absorb. I think this raises the issue of assessment. How do we know if what we're doing is working? How do we know if it's enough or too much? And that's something that is really going to come out of the particular group of teens that we're working with. And here too, reflection is a wonderful tool. If at the end of a program, the reflective activity shows that, or at the end of a meeting, the debrief from that meeting shows that they didn't get it, then it's too much. Then you have to scale back. But it's hard to say only this amount of material or as much as that amount of material. They have to feel like the material that they're getting is there for a reason, and it helps them in engaging in a process, in going on a journey that you've set out for them. So the right amount of material is the material they need to be able to go on that journey. Our job is to make sure that they understand it in that way, as opposed to you're coming to a meeting, we're here for 2 hours, and you're going to hear all kinds of stuff, and trust me, you'll need it someday. In educational parlance these days, that's called just-in-time learning as opposed to just-in-case learning. In other words, we learn things that we need versus learning stuff that you'll need someday.
This is Lindsay, and I'd like to just add that we actually structure our hour-and-a-half to 2-hour-long meetings, which happen once a month, with dinner or some sort of snack in the middle. I absolutely think that 2 hours or an hour-and-a-half of really focused learning can be too much for teens, and certainly we all know our teens best. If you have a room full of teens that are absolutely going to get antsy no matter how interesting the material or how engaging the conversation, after 45 minutes that's a great time to have a pizza delivered, or ask the teens to bring snacks for them for each other to share with one another in the middle of our learning, so that we give them a break so that when they come back they're refreshed and ready for what's next.
Thank you. Thanks for giving us both of your perspectives on this question. I have another question. So can you speak about the difference between reflection and evaluation? This program leader shares that I sometimes see educators using in quotes, "what do you think?" or "how did this make you feel?" as measures of information learning or methods of teaching content, even though it doesn't actually bring new information itself. So perhaps, Phil, you want to start with this question?
Sure. I think the question has the answer already embedded in it. The goal of reflection is to move the learner along that cycle, to move to a place where they have new insights. So for the person who is structuring the reflection, it means either the prompts or the follow-up questions or whatever it may be, has to be very mindful of a directional nature of their questioning, that they're moving towards something, not merely administering a test. And I think that's the difference. If your goal is to assess whether the information was learned, that's useful, but that's not reflection. That is evaluation. And questions can be used for a test. Here the goal is to ask open-ended questions that then have a follow-up. If I ask, "What do you think?" I'm asking that as a way of opening up a conversation that moves in a particular direction where, again, my educational outcomes, my enduring understandings are where I want us to go together. It's about the goal. If the goal is just to see whether or not the student has learned something, then you'll get exactly that. But the first question can move you in either direction. It's the second question and the third question and the fourth that are going to determine whether or not we're looking at reflection or simple assessment.
Great. Lindsay, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think Phil answered it perfectly. I agree.
Great. A follow-up question then. Are there any materials or reading that you would recommend for youth educators to develop skills in this area of how to ask those kind of questions?
Yes. Yes, there are. There's so much written on reflection and reflective tools. A handy tool for accessing them is something called Google, but I'm happy to pull together a few.
Great, thank you. I think that might be interesting to folks. We'll follow up about that. So we're coming to the end of our time together. I just want to see if there are any more questions. This is your last chance to get your questions into the chat before we close for today. All right, I think everyone's doing some personal reflection right now. You have to share it in order to see if you've really learned. So I hope you'll share the things that you've heard today with your colleagues. And with that, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's call. I want to give a special thank you to Phil and to Lizzie for really great presentations today. I also want to offer that if anyone wants to continue to talk about any of the things you heard today, you can get in touch with me at naomi@jtfn.org. Phil and Lindsay are both open to having follow-up conversations, and I'm also happy to talk more about relating these topics to your teen foundation. I know there's interest in whether the slides are available. They will be available. We'll be sending out the full call recording and the slides later today. And I want to let everyone know that the next JTFN Lunch and Learn webinar will be on Tuesday, January 14th. It is called Site Visits in Depth, so it will be speaking specifically about how a teen foundation does site visits, and I think it will definitely hit on some of the topics we talked about today, as site visits are particularly relevant to reflection. So you can RSVP for that at jtfn.org/events. And with that, again, thank you really so much to our presenters, and we look forward to seeing you back on these webinars in 2014. I'm going to unmute the line so that everyone can have a moment and say goodbye together. Hold on.
The conference has been unmuted.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks. Bye. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.